Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ZipCodeMatters Talking About Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're very excited about this presentation about the AFFH rule. And so without further ado, we're going to get started. So today's discussion is going to be in three parts, but before I really dive into the overview of the presentation, I just want to let people know that some housekeeping items. So first of all, we're going to be taking questions throughout the webinar today. So if you do have questions, the way that you will ask them is through the questions section of the GoToWebinar toolbar. So you'll see the toolbar on the right-hand corner of your screen. There's a questions section. All you have to do is just hit the little arrow button next to questions. Go ahead and type in your questions for us. And during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, we will come to your questions that way. So without further ado, we have three sections of the webinar. So the first is going to be led by Debbie Goldberg. She's Vice President for Housing Policy and Special Projects at the National Fair Housing Alliance. She's going to cover sort of an introduction of AFFH, provide a little bit of context into the discussion today. Next, we're going to go into a little bit more about the narrative and the messaging around AFFH that we're recommending folks use before, during, and after the release of this important rule. And that's going to be led by Eva Marie Malone, who's Economic Opportunity Coordinator at the Opportunity Agenda. My name is Kevin Paul. I'm the Communications Associate at the National Fair Housing Alliance. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be covering a little bit about the plan that we have for communications before, during, and after the release of the rule. So without further ado, I'd like to kick it over to Debbie Goldberg.
Thanks, Kevin, and hi, everyone. I'm Debbie Goldberg with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and I also want to welcome you to today's webinar. We're really pleased to have so many of you join us to discuss messaging and communication strategies for this important new regulation. And before I get started, I just want to give a shout out and big thanks to Eva Marie and her colleagues at the Opportunity Agenda, who have been great partners in this communications work. So as you all know, HUD has not yet released its Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH, rule in final form, and this webinar is not about the content of the rule. Once the rule is released, finally, we are planning other opportunities for groups in the field to get training on what it says and how it will work. However, we're anticipating that the rule may be released sometime later this month, and we think it's really critical for all of us to be prepared to talk about why it's important and what it will mean for our communities. Not everyone supports this rule, and you may encounter some of its critics in your communities. So we want to equip you to explain its significance and respond to its critics. After today's webinar, we'll be sending you some materials to help you do just that. These will include a messaging memo drafted jointly by NAFA and the Opportunity Agenda, along with a 2-page excerpt of the top-line themes and sample messages from that memo. We encourage you to take a few minutes to read through these documents. They'll really help you understand the most effective framing for our messages about fair housing generally and this rule in particular. They'll also walk you through some of the arguments raised by the rule's critics and suggest how you can counter those. And we'll be sending you a memo laying out the social media plans for the release of the rule, which Kevin will walk you through in a few minutes. And finally, I want to make sure that you're aware of a publication from the Opportunity Agenda called Realizing the Promise, How to Affirmatively Further Fair Housing, which is available on the Opportunity Agenda website. And that publication describes a variety of strategies for creating diverse and inclusive communities and for expanding access to opportunity. So now turning to the AFFH rule, I want to start by reiterating that this rule is important. It's one of the top 3 priorities that fair housing and civil rights groups have laid out for HUD under the Obama administration. The other 2 are the Disparate Impact Regulation, which was released in February of 2013, and a harassment rule, which we understand will be out for public comment soon. This rule is important because it's about connecting people to opportunity and doing it through the places where they live. We all know that where you live, your zip code matters. The place where you live is more than just a roof over your head. Bundled together with that housing unit are the schools your kids will attend, the jobs to which you'll have access, the transportation network you'll use, the grocery stores and other businesses that will serve you, the quality of the environment in which you'll live, the level of crime and violence to which you'll be exposed, your chances of being a homeowner and accumulating wealth, your life expectancy, and a host of other factors about your life. And the fact of the matter is that there are big differences among neighborhoods and the access to opportunity that they provide to their residents. These differences can be traced in part to a host of deliberate actions taken over many decades by government at the local, state, and federal levels to create racially and ethnically segregated communities. Take, for example, this map of Cleveland from the 1930s. It was produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, which was a federal government agency created following the Great Depression to help stabilize the housing market. The map rates the desirability of different neighborhoods to indicate whether federal mortgage assistance should be made available in those communities. The blue and green areas are the most desirable. The yellow areas are labeled definitely declining, and the red areas are deemed hazardous. In those neighborhoods, the HOLC would not make assistance available, and this is where the term redlining came from. The Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, followed the same policies in its programs to subsidize construction of suburban developments all across the country, and also in making mortgage insurance available to individual home buyers. The result was that people of color in those redline communities couldn't buy homes. This, in turn, meant that, unlike white working-class families who had access to those affordable, sustainable, government-backed mortgages, people of color were unable to use homeownership as a path for building wealth. The residential patterns that were set in place by the policies of the HOLC persist today. On this map of Cleveland, you can see how the neighborhoods along the Cuyahoga River and along the lakefront that were marked in red on the HOLC maps remain predominantly African American today. This map is based on 2010 census data. You can also see that virtually every neighborhood in Cleveland is either predominantly white, those are the areas shown in blue, or predominantly black, and those are the areas shown in red. And as you can see, the deepest shade of each color on the map represents areas where 85% or more of the residents are people of that particular racial or ethnic group. And so not only are neighborhoods segregated, they're very highly segregated. This is a map of Cleveland that was created by the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University. It looks at a variety of neighborhood indicators and aggregates them into an overall opportunity index. The darkest shades on the map indicate the communities with the highest scores or the greatest access to opportunity, and the lightest shades are those communities that provide the least access to opportunity according to the index. The green dots on the map show where African American residents are located, and you can see that they're concentrated in neighborhoods that fall at the bottom of the opportunity scale, in neighborhoods that provide their residents with the lowest level of access to opportunity. Many of these are the same neighborhoods that were coded in red on the HOLC map from the 1930s. This phenomenon is not unique to Cleveland. You can look at maps like these for almost any metropolitan area in the country and see similar patterns of segregation and lack of access to opportunity, all grounded in the policies and practices of the past. These maps illustrate how government policies of the past in just one area, housing, continue to haunt us today. You could also look at other policies, education, employment, environment, transportation, and the like, and find very similar patterns. And these play out not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but also for families with children and people with disabilities. The recent events in Baltimore, where people took to the streets and where the governor called in the National Guard to restore order, as well as similar events in other places around the country, have served to pull back the curtain on the lingering legacy of past discrimination and the problems it can cause today. And by problems, I don't mean the riots and demonstrations that have taken place, but rather the way these historical policies and practices continue to affect people's lives and prevent them from reaching their full potential. On the flip side, of course, is that we all benefit when we have diverse, inclusive communities where everyone has access to opportunity. Research shows us that kids do better in school and learn to be better problem solvers when their classmates are a diverse bunch. Businesses benefit from diversity both in their workforce and their customer base. Cities and regions that are diverse and inclusive have economies that are more robust. And as our population becomes more diverse and our country moves toward the day when no single racial or ethnic group is a majority, it's becoming more important than ever to ensure that everyone, regardless of their race or ethnicity, whether they have kids or have a disability, has access to the opportunities that they need to succeed. And in an increasingly interconnected world and a global economy, our diversity can be a source of strength. These lessons are not new. The kinds of problems for which Baltimore has become emblematic are not new. We had exactly the same kinds of problems in the late 1960s when what we called race riots broke out in more than 100 cities, including Baltimore, where this photo was taken. The National Guard was called out then too. The problems of Baltimore and Detroit and Newark and Cincinnati and cities all across the country were well documented by a commission set up by President Johnson to figure out what happened in those cities, why it happened, and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. The Kerner Commission, as that was called, focused on the harm to society caused by extreme racial segregation. It warned that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. It called for enactment of a law to prohibit discrimination in housing and for the government to refocus its housing programs to create more safe, decent, and affordable housing outside of areas of racial concentration and poverty. 1 month after the Kerner Commission issued its report, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And 1 week after his death, President Johnson signed into law the Fair Housing Act. It embodied those two recommendations made by the Kerner Commission, banning discrimination in housing and taking active steps to overcome the prevailing patterns of racial segregation. That second part, overcoming racial segregation, that's what HUD's new rule is all about. This rule won't solve all of our problems by any stretch of the imagination, but it will help refocus our attention on the many ways in which zip code matters. It will help communities zero in on places where segregation and poverty are still problems and where they limit residents' access to opportunity. It will help communities be more strategic about the way they use their housing and community development resources to provide more equitable access to opportunity. This means that communities will have to both invest in neighborhoods that have been left behind and also expand affordable housing options in those opportunity-rich places where they're lacking. This rule is something that the civil rights community has been waiting for pretty much since 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. It's been a long time in the making, and the country has never needed it more. It's our rule, and in order for it to be effective, we'll all need to use it, to be engaged in its implementation in our communities. And the more positive the reception this rule gets, the easier that process will be. We all have a role to play in making sure that this rule is welcomed, is viewed as a step forward, and is recognized as a tool that will help strengthen all of our communities. For many of us, especially those of us in the fair housing world who are used to using an enforcement frame when talking about our work, it will mean adopting a different frame. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to turn it over to Eva Marie to get that conversation started.
Thank you, Debbie. So as Kevin mentioned, I'll be discussing some communications points around narrative and messaging. Next slide. So the narrative that we found helpful in terms of framing the discussion of fair housing is relating how it protects equal opportunity and provides freedom from discrimination. Some very preliminary research that we've been doing has shown that there are some audiences for whom segregation implies a past problem, something that's over, and who believe that we live in a world of free housing choice. But telling a story about the ways in which fair housing uplifts equal opportunity can be beneficial. Next slide. And it's also helpful to make clear the ways in which promoting fair housing builds opportunity and benefits the entire community. As Debbie already mentioned, there are some very specific ways, some specific concrete benefits for the entire community when development is geared towards expanding opportunity. And in an increasingly diverse world, those concrete benefits, it's good to make clear how they can be linked to positive developments in housing for the community at large. Next slide. So there are several themes that underlie that narrative, and let's explore them a little bit. The first is expanding opportunity. Fair housing generally, and the AFFH rule in particular, act to expand opportunity by providing access to and building a web of safe and affordable home, good transportation, good education, and good jobs, all of which then continue to benefit the community in a cyclical fashion. Next slide. It's also, the next theme is fighting the growth of income inequality. And I'm sure many of you have seen articles that discuss the dangers of growing income inequality, as well as income inelasticity. So AFFH is an effective tool to combat inequality. For example, by enabling decision makers to deploy resources and plan for community resources equitably. Next slide. It's also important to highlight that AFFH ensures that, or is a tool for ensuring that no communities are left behind by, for example, shaping community investments in housing, in transportation, environment, health, education, or infrastructure and economic development in a way that achieves opportunity, specifically through housing and development, and also to overcome the ongoing impact of segregation. Next slide. And we've noted that it's important to make the connection between the ways in which AFFH promotes diversity and diversity's benefit to the common good. So diversity benefits everyone. Some ways in which diversity is beneficial to the community at large is providing greater education, a broader customer base for businesses, robust neighborhoods, and for example, as Debbie mentioned, students in diverse schools have better educational outcomes. Next slide. AFFH is also an important tool for toppling barriers, and this theme is particularly important. Just like the connection between diversity and the common good or benefits to the community at large, it is both active and positive. And it's been shown to be particularly resonant with audiences, especially younger audiences, discussing the ways in which affirmatively furthering fair housing removes barriers to opportunity, empowers your audience to take action, and therefore it's a helpful way of discussing the topic generally. Next slide. And finally, the theme of accountability and public trust. The AFFH rule makes entities that accept federal funds for housing or development accountable to uphold our shared value of opportunity and diversity in the use of those funds. And this theme reflects a greater belief in accountability and public trust, that our money will be used in ways that reflects our values. Next slide. So there are a few public opinion points that support this way of discussing fair housing generally and affirmatively furthering fair housing specifically. First, 9 in 10 Americans who are polled see discrimination against one or more groups as a serious problem. And this means that the harm of discrimination is an idea that is likely to resonate with your audience. Next slide. Furthermore, 6 in 10 Americans have actually experienced unfair treatment due to their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their financial status, their sexual orientation, their religious belief, and or their accent, which means that a majority of your audience can be reached if you can contextualize the discrimination that they've experienced with the concept of housing discrimination. Next slide. And also, it's important to note that 60% of Americans believe that laws to prevent housing discrimination are about rights. A further 31% believe that those laws are too weak. This indicates a widespread support for a regulation that can be described as being designed to combat housing discrimination. Next slide. So, what does all of that information mean for how we devise particular messages, how we implement that narrative? To build support for our work as it relates to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and to develop messages that can begin to create an echo chamber and be supportive of our overlapping efforts, discuss affirmatively furthering fair housing in a way that emphasizes the values and mutual benefits of equal opportunity and community. Discuss AFFH in a way that highlights systemic causes and unequal opportunity. And it's also helpful to promote effective solutions and successes, and to build on those solutions that have a high level of support. Next slide. So finally, we've also found it particularly helpful when discussing fair housing to invoke a positive role for government and to lift up the voices of those who are most impacted. It's important to note, though, when you're lifting up those stories of the people who have been most impacted, to tell thematic stories, stories that are not just persuasive, but also indicate an overall solution. Next slide. So there are some additional resources that are available. Obviously, our website, but we have a page that collects many of our affirmatively furthering fair housing resources, which is the second link, and the report that Debbie mentioned earlier, which discusses AFFH and talks about some lessons learned from implementation of AFFH, can be found at opportunityagenda.org, Realizing the Promise. And if you were interested in some of the public opinion points that I mentioned earlier, you can explore our interactive site, which goes into some of the detail about our omnibus survey that shows a broad range of points related to opportunity generally, and you can sort of bore down and look at points related to housing opportunity in particular if you're interested. So thank you, and now Kevin will discuss some ways in which we can specifically communicate around AFFH and the release. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eva Marie Malone. That was a really great introduction to some of the messaging points that we're going to implement ahead of, during, and then after the announcement of the AFFH rule. So I'm just going to cover very quickly some of the options that we have and some of the supporting documents we're going to be providing you. So, Eva Marie talked about communicating a shared message and creating an echo chamber. So, in support of those two goals, we really need your help. We need the help of everyone on the line, and moving into the announcement day. So we have sort of a menu of different options that you can pick and choose from, recognizing that different organizations and institutions are going to have a different amount of capacity as well as expertise in their communications work. So I'm going to cover some social media aspects. We have a press statement template that we're going to be providing everyone. We're encouraging people to post blogs if they have blogs, as well as op-eds to their local media markets. So social media. We're going to be very engaged on Twitter and Facebook throughout this campaign, leading into, during, and after the announcement. We're going to be using the hashtag ZipCodeMatters to really highlight the role that place and zip code play in determining your opportunities as a person living in the United States today. And so using this hashtag in various ways, first of all with any material that you post on social media about AFFH, but also using the hashtag as a way of highlighting intersections between existing materials and content that are out on social media. So I've just posted a little example here about how you can do that. Yesterday, the Urban Institute posted a tweet about some reflections on Baltimore at an event that they sponsored. So, a suggestion is you can hit the retweet button if you're on Twitter, and then go ahead and add in the hashtag ZipCodeMatters with a little explanation about where that intersection might lie with that particular piece of content. So, again, in addition to posting your own content, make sure that you're retweeting and adding the hashtag to sort of raise awareness and then draw those connections. As I mentioned before, we're going to be distributing some sample materials around social media. So those materials will include a number of sample posts. And again, those posts are going to be they're going to be separated based on whether you should post them before, during, or after the announcement. And feel free to use that language verbatim or adapt it to your individual needs. In addition to the posts, we're going to be providing you with some racial dot maps. And these are a great way of demonstrating that segregation is not something that's just in the history books. It's something that exists today in our communities. And so we'll have a number of maps from major metropolitan areas demonstrating segregation. We're also going to be including a list of links to various resources that you can include in your tweets and Facebook posts. These include articles about segregation and AFFH, ranging all the way to different maps and sort of resources that demonstrate the continuing need for this rule. Again, on social media, in addition to posting your own content, we really want to make sure that everyone's engaged and active in looking out for new content and also amplifying our messages as they go out. So we have here the two Twitter handles for our organizations, Nat Fairhouse for National Fair Housing Alliance, of course, and Agenda for the Opportunity Agenda. We also have the links to the Facebook posts, Facebook walls as well. And we're going to be distributing a PDF of this presentation after the webinar for you to reference this information. In addition to the social media aspects of the plan, we're also going to be distributing a template press statement for people to use. And so this is a great way to, again, amplify the message, reach out to your local media markets with a really positive and a positive perspective on AFFH, so that we can get our message out into the media. And so again, we're going to be distributing the template, but also we're going to have that messaging memo and top-line messages that you can sort of plug in and adapt as you see fit. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is, when you're doing a press statement in your local market, it's good to highlight as much local flavor as possible in that messaging. So, if you have a quote from someone in your office or institution, and also, that would be great to include some local perspective in that statement. Similar to the press statement, we're encouraging people to write blogs and op-eds if they have the capacity and they have the the capacities to do that. And feel free to adapt the press statement or use messaging from the memo and the top-line messaging points. Again, add local stories, history, and perspective to that to really appeal to your local jurisdiction. And also, we'll have the racial dot maps and other graphics for you to use as well. I've outlined a little timeline here for our for our campaign. So we have the before the announcement section of the campaign. We want to make sure that we get out on social media very quickly and consistently. So we're urging people to post social media messages 3 times per week, to retweet folks and use the ZipCodeMatters hashtag, and also to begin this process of drafting blogs, op-eds, press statements, so that when we're ready and we know that the regulation's coming out, that we can sort of have everything ready to go and ready to roll. During the announcement, of course, we're going to send out an email reading AFFH alert in the title. This email will include all of these instructions in addition to all of the materials that have been distributed prior to this email. So that'll include the memo, the top-line messaging, all of the resources and the photos and the social media materials. So of course, on announcement day, that's when you really want to release the statement, as well as any blogs or op-eds if you do have those prepared. And of course, on announcement day as well, you want to monitor the hashtag ZipCodeMatters on Facebook and Twitter. Post-announcement, of course, that echo chamber doesn't end the day of the announcement. We want to make sure that people are staying engaged. They're posting on their websites, they're posting on social media, they're engaging with local media about the AFFH rule and its importance in your community. And so, we're encouraging people to continue to post, especially in the 2 weeks following the rule. So, without further ado, that kind of concludes our presentation today. I know we have a couple of questions already, but we wanted to open it up for folks to ask questions if they are curious about different aspects about messaging, the AFFH rule, or about our campaign plan today. So again, just to remind you how you can ask questions during the webinar, during the Q&A session. If you take a look at your GoToWebinar toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a little question section. Just go ahead and type in there, hit enter, and then that'll we'll go ahead and read it aloud. Great. So I guess we can start with our first question. So there's a question about the statistics that were referenced, that Eva Marie Malone referenced during her portion. And I know we talked about the opportunity survey, but Eva Marie, if you want to just talk a little bit more about sort of where those statistics came from, what that survey is, and sort of what other relevant information might we be able to find.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So we did a large omnibus survey last year, which asked a number of questions about different aspects of opportunity, so about economic opportunity, about housing opportunity, some questions, I think there were some questions about poverty, and also I think there were some questions as well about racial justice. And so we wanted to be sure that we were really deploying all of that material in a way that was most helpful to our partners, sort of answer that we got a taste of public opinion, but that we could also put it out in a way that other people could sort of explore the information and use the information themselves. And to do that, we put a lot of work into developing a sort of an interactive website, which that's the link that I included on my on one of my slides. But you can also, I think, find the link to the survey website on the Opportunity Agendas page. So all of the points that the public opinion points that I referenced come from the some housing-related and discrimination-related questions on that survey.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a question essentially asking, if this basically if this mandate, if this AFFH mandate has been in part of the law for so long, what's new about this rule? What's changing after this rule?
I think that's probably one for me. This is Debbie. So to be completely clear, we should say that there is currently an AFFH rule on the books. But in 2010, the Government Accountability Office took a look at HUD's oversight of this part of the Fair Housing Act and looked at a lot of the fair housing plans that had been created by different jurisdictions throughout the country, and found that the system that we have in place now really wasn't working very well at all, and raised concerns about the kind of guidance that HUD has available to its grantees who are required to do this kind of planning, and also the kind of oversight that HUD provides. So for example, jurisdictions are supposed to do something called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice approximately once every 5 years, but they don't have to submit that to HUD, and it's not necessarily reviewed by anyone at HUD, and so it has there are no real implications necessarily for not taking that step, no downside for not carrying out that obligation. And there has never been any formal linkage between the kinds of issues that might be flagged through an analysis of impediments and any other actions really taken by the jurisdiction. They're supposed to identify actions, they're supposed to report on what actions they take, but that's kind of as far as it goes. So this regulation will do a couple of things that we view as being really noteworthy. One is that it provides a framework for how to analyze these kinds of questions. HUD is going to provide jurisdictions with a template that will kind of walk them through an analysis of conditions in their communities, looking at integration and segregation, looking at access to opportunity and exposure to environmental hazards, and those sorts of things. The template will ask jurisdictions to identify their top priorities and then to develop some strategies for addressing those priority fair housing issues, and to set up some benchmarks for making progress. And then HUD is going to look at the plans that jurisdictions develop for how they're going to spend their housing and community development dollars, the consolidated plan or CON plan that jurisdictions do approximately every 5 years. And it will look to see that the priorities and that the strategies that are identified in their new fair housing plan, which is going to be called an assessment of fair housing, are reflected in the way they're proposing to spend their money through the consolidated planning process, or in their consolidated plan document and the annual updates to that. So there is, and I should have said at the beginning, HUD is also providing to jurisdictions a host of data on all sorts of aspects of demographics and links to opportunity that they will be able to use, and some tools for analyzing those and mapping those so that they can do this kind of robust analysis. So there are a whole set of things here that are different than the system that we have in place. The better data, the consistent framework for how to analyze the data, leaving the specifics of the priorities and the solutions to the locality to figure out, but then it will be reviewed. The planning documents that jurisdictions do will be reviewed by HUD, will have to be accepted by HUD. If they don't meet basic standards, they'll be sent back to the jurisdiction to revise and improve. And then, as I say, HUD will be looking at the linkage between the assessment of fair housing and the way money is proposed to be spent through the CON plan process. And there's a parallel here to what public housing authorities will also be doing, and linking it to their PHA planning process. So there's a number of aspects of this rule that we think are huge improvements over the system that we currently have in place.
Great. Thanks so much, Debbie. So we have another question, and I think this is a great question. Maybe we can go first to Debbie, and then we can go to Eva Marie Malone for this. So what's the first thing that people should know about this new AFFH rule? What do you think is like the leading message that we want to put out there about AFFH?
So the way I think about it, it really is about linking people to opportunity and doing it through the place that they live. And that both and kind of proposition that I mentioned in my earlier comments, that when we look at the legacy of past discrimination and we see the problems that it creates in our communities today, the solutions require two things. On the one hand, making sure that we provide the kind of investments that have been lacking in communities that have been left behind, and also that we expand the range of housing options that are available to people in what some might term opportunity-rich communities. So it's really about this opportunity framework and making sure that we're lifting everybody up and creating the kind of diverse and inclusive communities that benefit us all.
Great. Eva Marie, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just note that it's important to, I think, when generally framing AFFH, if you're asking about how to talk about it, how to communicate about it, just to point out that it is a method of that the new rule is essentially a method of expanding opportunity, that it's a method of combating discrimination, and that it's meant to help make all of our communities sort of consonant with our values, and also to talk about the ways in which it increases benefits to the entire community.
And Kevin, one other thing that I would add is, this maybe isn't the very first thing I would say, but I think it's a really important thing for people to keep in mind, and that's that while this particular AFFH regulation may be new, the obligation for entities that get federal funding for housing and community development to be affirmatively furthering fair housing, that's not new. You know, that's been in the law since it was passed in 1968. And so what this rule is going to do is to help communities engage in that more effectively and be more strategic about the ways that they use their housing and community development dollars.
Great, thanks so much to both of you. So taking a look here, it looks like that was our last question of the day here. Did either of you want to have some closing remarks, or do you think that we should wrap up the presentation?
Well, so this is Debbie. I just want to again say thanks to everyone for joining us today. We look forward to working with everyone on carrying out this campaign and really welcome your participation in getting the message out about how important this rule is and how it's going to be beneficial to all of us and all of our communities. And keep your fingers crossed that the rule gets announced soon.
Great. So actually, we have one more question I just wanted to kind of interject here, and I think this is something that maybe a lot of people are kind of being asked about AFFH, and I think it's something that we should really address during this this webinar specifically. So what are the best ways to counter the argument that the federal government is essentially overreaching here when it comes to AFFH? I know that narrative has sort of been out there about this rule. And so, you know, I'd like to get both of your thoughts about, you know, sort of the local approach that jurisdictions can take in implementing the rule, and what the provisions are in the rule for addressing, you know, local control. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there for folks.
Eva Marie, you want to take that first?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that this is not about, it's not, this new rule is not about really the federal government. It's about making clear to both localities, and it's about implementation on the ground, and it's meant to, I think, to really make clear how to affirmatively further fair housing. So it's not about implementation of kind of a federal mandate. This rule is really about a locality or a locality choosing to seek federal funds and just upholding some very basic principles that we all agree to.
So I would echo that and say, you know, there is this accountability element to it, right? That when jurisdictions take federal funding, they do that on the condition that they carry out this and a number of other obligations, right? But that part of the quid pro quo for getting taxpayer dollars is that they will pay attention in the way that they spend those dollars to promoting fair housing and expanding fair housing and housing choice. And that's if they don't want to take the federal government money, they don't have to do that. But if they're going to take the federal government money, then they have to be held accountable to this long-standing obligation. At the same time, however, this rule does not impose particular strategies or approaches from on high. This is not the heavy hand of HUD telling jurisdictions what they have to do. It's not anybody in Washington rewriting local zoning codes. It's not about that at all. While HUD does provide a framework for analyzing these issues and a bunch of data that will be very valuable to jurisdictions and to which they can add their own data if they have other kinds of data that they think are useful. And there will be, the mapping and other tools that jurisdictions can use to analyze the data and understand the conditions within their jurisdictions. In the end, it's left to each individual jurisdiction to identify its priorities, to identify the strategies that it thinks will work best, and to set the benchmarks against which its progress should be measured. So there is a tremendous amount of local flexibility and local control in the way this rule has been designed.
Thanks so much. So that looks like that concludes our question and answer session. So yeah, so I think that kind of concludes our webinar for today. And again, if you have any questions additionally to ask our panelists, feel free to reach out to me directly at kpaul@nationalfairhousing.org. You'll see my email address also in all of the follow-up emails that you received for this webinar. So also, make sure to keep an eye out for all the materials we're going to send out, from the messaging memo and the top-line messaging all the way to the sample social media materials. So thank you all so much. Thanks to Opportunity Agenda for taking part in this effort, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.